rock and makes arrowheads, hatchets, that kind of thing. It's like what the Indians did. Okay, any other announcements? If not, I am so pleased to have with us the official river historian from Rome to talk to us about traffic on the rivers in Rome just a few years past, right? This is Mr. Denis Nordeman, and we're delighted to have him. Y'all, thank you for coming.
I don't know whether I need this or not. Do I need this? Can you hear me?
Is it on?
Is it on?
No.
There's a switch on the microphone itself.
It's on. It may not be working, but it's on. It doesn't work?
Switch on the bottom.
Did you
That's
flip?
okay. Can you hear me without it?
Yeah.
Yes.
We don't need
There's
it.
a switch on here. Did you see?
Yeah, it's on.
It's on. But there's also a volume switch down there.
Okay, but we don't need it.
If you're fine without it, we're fine without it.
Let's see if we can make some pictures come up now. Y'all gave Carol a nice round of applause. I hope you're as happy with her job after I get done tonight. All right. It sits there and looks at me and it's doing fine until the time to start, and then it quits.
It's coming.
All right. The city of Rome owns a vessel called the Roman Holiday. Have any of you ever been to Rome and enjoyed a trip on the Roman Holiday? Well, this is probably going to be old hat to you then, because if I was the captain on the day that you were on the trip on the Roman Holiday, you've heard most of this already. But Rome has a real interesting history in terms of the rivers. And I'd like to start at the beginning. In the beginning, God created the interstate highway system. And he saw that it was good, and he called them rivers. And in the early 1800s, a man had finally conquered the ability to come back upstream. Prior to that time, going downstream was a piece of cake. Turning around and rolling back upstream was kind of tough, especially if you have a big freight load. But we harnessed steam in the early 1800s. And by the time Rome was founded in 1834, the rivers were already designated as being navigable. The Oostanala River and the Etowah River come together in Rome to form the Coosa River. And the Coosa River goes downstream. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, they had already been surveyed by the national government, Corps of Engineers, and found to be navigable. So one of the main reasons, I guess, Rome was founded was for the spring in downtown Rome, just like Cedartown was founded because of its water resources, the big spring down here that formed the location for Cedartown. Rome had a spring downtown too, but in addition to that spring, we had the two rivers coming together and forming the third. So the steamboat era began in Rome well, let's talk about navigating the Coosa River system. Rome sits at the confluence of the Oostanala River and the Etowah River. The Etowah River doesn't have any major tributaries, but the Oostanala River has the Conasauga and the Coosa-Wati River together. And this is all pretty important because look at the one river that forms the Oostanala, comes up here, curls into Tennessee, very close to the Tennessee River system, right in that area. About 12 miles between where that river is and the Tennessee River system. So canals got to be a big proposal. But anyway, from the confluence of those rivers to Rome is about 100 miles on the Oostanala River, navigable. And from Rome down to a little bit below Gadsden, Alabama, where there was a town called Greensport, it was also found to be navigable. And I'm going to walk off the stage here and break my neck. But below Greensport, which sits about right here, or used to sit right here, it's underwater right now, down to Wetumpka, Alabama, this section of the river was not navigable, except for the story that I'll tell you a little bit later that happened during the Civil War. So when we harnessed steam, we were able to do two things. We were able to finally go on land, of course, apply steam to land travel by railroads, and apply steam to water travel by way of rivers. Rivers were set, we got made. They were God's interstate highways. If you look at the major cities in the Midwest of America, they're all sitting on the rivers, because that's how people got there. They got on a riverboat in Pennsylvania, and they could go all the way down to New Orleans, Louisiana, or go up the Missouri River all the way. They hoped at one time to go to the West Coast, but they couldn't do that. But Lewis and Clark had a go at it. So river systems used to be the interstate highways, and the steamboats took advantage of that. The steamboats began in early 1800s, and because the highways were already existing, they could develop great routes. They could they could carry the freight. The railroad had the disadvantage. They had to make their own highways. They had to make the rails. So it took them a lot longer to develop. But if you'll notice the technology, as the railroads got more and more places and got to every little town, then the Coosa River system basically couldn't compete with that anymore. The Coosa River was lagging behind a little bit with the ability to make it renew the navigability of it, and the railroads took over. So from about 1845 to about 1880 or 1890, the steamboats were king or queen on the Coosa River and on the Oostenaula River. The railroads weren't yet going to every little town, but in about the 1880s, 1890s, the railroads were finally spreading their tentacles out everywhere, and beginning to be able to get people reliably to another town on a schedule which the people liked. Steamboats were never able to do that. So that's kind of a broad history of it. Steamboats gung-ho to begin with, railroads slower to progress because of the having to build the roads, but then the railroads finally got everywhere, and as a result, they end up putting the Coosa River steamboats at least out of business. So in 1843 or 44, somewhere in that area, they were planning on the railroad, trying to build a railroad. They had driven a stake in a place called Terminus, Georgia. It's driven a stake, and that was Terminus because that was the beginning of the railroad system. We call that town Atlanta right now, and that place is 5 Points. But on the speculation that the main line of the railroad was going to come through Rome, one of our local guys built a steamboat in 1843. Mr. Smith, I think is what his name was. But the railroad didn't come directly to Rome, Georgia. It went from Terminus or Marthasville or Atlanta, however you want to call it, straight to Chattanooga by way of Cartersville and Kingston and some of the other towns. And Rome was kind of shoved off to the rivers in downtown Rome. We did a survey a few years ago and never found anything about it, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. It's still there. I've always believed, if you've been on the Roman holiday with me, I've always felt like truth is like a rubber band. It's much more useful if you stretch it a little bit. So the first steamboat that steamed into Rome came in 1845. Now, I'm not going to go through a litany of the list of steamboats, which is why my picture got in the paper and how Carol found it about me, because that would take too long, and you're not here for a listing of steamboats. But I will tell you some interesting stories. Now, the Coosa, the steamer Coosa was the first steamer that came down the Coosa River. It was actually built in Cincinnati, Ohio, and a lot of boats were built in Cincinnati and Louisville area, but the Coosa was put on the river in Ohio, and it was navigated down the Ohio River and down the Mississippi River, across the Gulf of Mexico, into the Bay of Mobile, up the Mobile River, up the Alabama River to Wetumpka. And what did I say about the lower part of the Coosa? It's not navigable. From Wetumpka to Greensport was not navigable. It was shoals and not dams, but rocks and rapids and too fast-moving water, and it just wasn't navigable. So they had to dismantle the Coosa and haul it by ox cart up to Greensport, where they put it back together again. And on July 4th, 1845, the Coosa, the steamer Coosa, was the first of the steamboats that came by up the Coosa River. And you can imagine what that was like to the people in Rome or not Cave Springs, but Cedar Bluff or Center, Alabama, never having seen a steamboat before. What the captains used to do is put in a little theatrics as they approached the town. They may stoke the fire with a little bit of green wood so that the black smoke was billowing out of the top of the chimneys. And in Rome, if you look at the rivers, you're standing in downtown Rome, you can see the first about half a mile or 3/4 mile of the river. But then it makes a bend and you don't see the river anymore, it's just tree line. So can you imagine in 1845, around July 4th, 1845, being in downtown Rome, and you look out and you see this billowing black smoke above the trees coming towards Rome, and you think, well, maybe the river's on fire. But it wasn't. It was the Coosa, and on the side of the ship, the Coosa, was three letters and the word Coosa. Coosa was the name of the steamer. The 3 letters were USM for United States Mail. It had the mail contract from between Rome and Gaston or Greensport. It was carrying the mail, so it had USM Coosa across the bottom. And everybody in those days weren't necessarily literate, but there was one fella in Center, Alabama, when asked, what does it say on that boat out there? He looked at it and he said, well, it's USM, that'd be Usum. COOSA, that'd be Susie. That's the Usum Susie out there. And the Usum Susie plied the waters for an unknown number of years, but it was the first of the steamboats on the Coosa. And not all of the steamboats, but most of the steamboats on the Coosa were of the packet boat variety. This is a picture of the last of the steamboats. This is the Cherokee. We'll be showing a picture of that later. But a packet boat was a boat that is like this. On the upper decks were the passengers' seats. Now, if you could afford the passenger to pay your way, you'd have a nice room, you'd have good meals, you might have a band, you might be able to play poker with your friends. It was a nice area where the upper class, or the folks that could afford the ticket, stayed. On the bottom deck was the freight deck. A packet boat is a freighter and a passenger boat. And of course, this is the helm or the pilot house up here. So this, in a normal condition, would be stacked full of cotton bales, corn, wheat, whatever was coming up and downstream. This has got a lot of wood on it because that was the fuel that was used to heat up the water to create the steam. But the whole bottom deck of a packet boat is freight. The next deck up would be the passenger, or the social area, the galley, and other things. The boilers are up here, this tall stacks. The boiler, you can see the fire there, and the wood for the fire. And so the steam was created here. This was actually called the boiler deck because the fireboxes were down here. The boilers were here, heating up the water, generating the steam. Then there'd be a pipe to go back here to where the steam engines were actually driving the wheel with just like an old steam train. They just drive the wheel back and forth. So that's basically what a packet boat was. And for the most part, all the boats on the Coosa were packet boats. Later on, there were some tugs, which were boats that didn't carry passengers. It was just push barges and that type of thing. But for the most part, that's what a typical packet boat would look like on the Coosa. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and talk to you a little bit about some of the, we're not quite in the peak times yet, but we're approaching Civil War. This is in the Civil War area. The Civil War in was critical in Rome. The steamboats, when you read the 1861, 62 newspapers in Rome, you see the steamboats arriving in town with recruits. They were coming to Rome to get on the train. By that time, the rail had a spur line coming to Rome, so the steam boats would come to Rome. Folks in freight would get off in Rome, get on the freight line or the railroad, and head out towards Kingston and get on the main line, which goes from Atlanta to Chattanooga. So the steamboats were definitely early on carrying soldiers and volunteers to Rome. Later on, they were carrying prisoners of war to Rome for the rail. They were carrying Rome, like every other town in the South, I think, was a hospital center during the Civil War, and they were carrying wounded, both Yankee and Confederate wounded, to the hospitals in Rome and other towns. So the railroads, the steamboats were a critical part of the communication and the transportation and the logistics of the thing. So when Rome was being conquered, so to speak, in 1864, the prize would have been the steamboats. General Jefferson Davis from Sherman's army had come to Rome. And at that point in time, there were two steamboats in town, the Alpharetta and the Laura Moore. And of course, they would have been prizes. That would have been a great coup for the Yankees if they could capture those and be able to handle the logistics of getting their supplies from down the Oostanala or up from Greensport or wherever else. So they would have been great prizes. So if you're picturing Rome, I don't know, your Shorter Hill sits up there just down the river from Rome a little bit, and that's where General Davis had some artillery. Well, Captain Cummings Lay was one of the captains of the ships that were in town. He did not want those ships to be captured. So the daring part of it is he created what they call a cottonclad. Now, you've heard a lot about ironclad